The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, condensed for people who have no patience to read. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me advice that I've been thinking about ever since. He said, whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages you've had. That's why I tend to reserve judgment, and it's why I ended up spending a summer surrounded by some of the most reckless and tragic people I've ever known. I came east in 1922, after fighting in the Great War, to learn about the bond business. It seemed like the thing to do at the time, and I ended up in West Egg, Long Island, living in a small, modest house next to a mansion that looked like it had been shipped in piece by piece from Europe. The mansion belonged to J. Gatsby, but I didn't know that at first. All I knew was that Gatsby threw the most extravagant parties that everyone seemed to go to, whether they were invited or not. People would just show up, drink Gatsby's champagne, and gossip about the mysterious host. No one really knew where Gatsby came from, or how he made his money. Some said he was a bootlegger. Others said he was a relative of Kaiser Wilhelm. But I didn't think much of it at the time. My cousin Daisy lived just across the bay in East Egg with her husband Tom Buchanan. Tom was the kind of man you couldn't help but notice. A big, strong, hulking guy who came from old money. He had everything handed to him his whole life, but there was a kind of anger simmering just beneath the surface. He was always looking for something, always restless, like all that wealth wasn't enough to fill the empty space inside him. Daisy, for all her beauty and charm, seemed fragile. She had this way of talking, like her voice was full of promises, but when you looked closely, there wasn't much underneath. They had a daughter, but Daisy didn't seem particularly attached to her. What mattered to her was living in the moment, keeping up the pretense of her marriage, even though Tom was openly having an affair with a woman named Myrtle Wilson. Myrtle was married to George Wilson, who ran a shabby garage in the Valley of Ashes, a desolate wasteland that lay between West Egg and New York City. George was a poor, beaten-down man, and Myrtle couldn't stand him. She wanted something more, and she thought she'd found it in Tom. Tom treated her like a toy, a distraction, but Myrtle didn't seem to mind. She thought Tom would take her away from her dull life, but of course, he never had any intention of doing that. I first met Gatsby one night when he invited me to one of his infamous parties. The mansion was filled with guests, most of them people who didn't even know Gatsby, but they all showed up for the free liquor and the spectacle. Gatsby stood apart from it all. He wasn't the wild playboy everyone imagined. He was almost shy, watching the chaos around him like an outsider. When we finally met, I was struck by how polite he was, how carefully he chose his words. He seemed more interested in hearing about me than in talking about himself. Over the next few weeks, Gatsby and I became friends. He took me out in his fancy car, showed me around New York, and even told me a little about his past. He said he was the son of wealthy parents from the Midwest, educated at Oxford, and a decorated war hero. But something about his story didn't add up. Still, there was a charm to Gatsby, an innocence almost, that made me believe he meant well. It wasn't long before I learned the real reason Gatsby had come to West Egg and why he threw those enormous parties. 5 years earlier, before he went off to war, he had fallen in love with Daisy. Back then, he was a poor young soldier, and Daisy was the beautiful debutante every man wanted. They had a brief romance, but when Gatsby left for Europe, Daisy married Tom, who could give her the kind of life Gatsby couldn't. But Gatsby never forgot her. He spent the next 5 years building a fortune, driven by one goal: to win Daisy back. Gatsby had bought the mansion in West Egg so he could be near her. He threw his parties hoping she would wander in one night, or that he'd catch a glimpse of her across the bay. But that never happened. So Gatsby asked me to invite Daisy to tea at my house. He was too nervous to contact her himself, afraid of what she might think of him after all these years. The day of the meeting, Gatsby was a wreck. He was so nervous he nearly ran away before Daisy even arrived. But when they saw each other again, it was like no time had passed. Daisy seemed to melt into his arms, and Gatsby was radiant with hope. He believed, with everything in him, that Daisy would leave Tom and be with him. He thought they could just erase the last 5 years as if they had never happened. For a while, it seemed like Gatsby's dream might come true. Daisy started visiting him at his mansion, and they spent long afternoons together, just the two of them. Gatsby was completely devoted to her, and he made plans for their future, believing that Daisy would tell Tom she never loved him and that they would be together forever. But Tom wasn't blind. He began to suspect something was going on, and it all came to a head on a sweltering day in the city. We had all gone to New York together, Tom, Daisy, Gatsby, Jordan Baker, and I. Tom was tense, and the tension grew worse as the day went on. Finally, at the Plaza Hotel, Tom confronted Gatsby directly. He mocked Gatsby's past, calling him a fraud, accusing him of making his money through illegal means, which wasn't entirely untrue. Tom demanded that Daisy tell Gatsby she never loved him. But Daisy, in that moment, couldn't do it. She admitted she had loved Gatsby once, but she also loved Tom. Gatsby's face fell. His dream, the one he had spent years building, shattered in front of him. The ride back to Long Island was a nightmare. Gatsby and Daisy went ahead in Gatsby's yellow car, while Tom, Jordan, and I followed behind. As we passed through the Valley of Ashes, we saw a commotion outside George Wilson's garage. Myrtle Wilson had been hit by a car and killed. Tom realized it had been Gatsby's car that struck her. George was inconsolable, believing someone had run Myrtle down on purpose. Later that night, Gatsby told me what had really happened. It was Daisy who had been driving the car when it hit Myrtle. She had been too upset after the argument at the plaza, and when Myrtle ran into the road, Daisy couldn't stop in time. Gatsby, still hopelessly in love with Daisy, told me he would take the blame. He was willing to sacrifice everything for her. The next morning, Gatsby swam in his pool for the first time all summer, waiting for Daisy to call and tell him she had left Tom. But the call never came. Instead, George Wilson, convinced that Gatsby had killed Myrtle and was having an affair with her, came to Gatsby's mansion and shot him. Then George turned the gun on himself. I was the only one left to arrange Gatsby's funeral. All the people who had come to his parties, who had drunk his champagne and gossiped about him, didn't even bother to show up. Daisy and Tom disappeared, leaving no forwarding address. They went back to their lives, as careless and self-absorbed as ever, while Gatsby was left behind in death, just as he had been in life. Gatsby's father came to the funeral. He was a frail old man, proud of his son, despite everything. From him, I learned more about Gatsby's past. His real name was James Gatz, and he had grown up poor on a farm in North Dakota. He had always dreamed of something better, of being someone great, and when he met Dan Cody, a wealthy copper magnate, he saw his chance. Gatsby changed his name and devoted himself to becoming the man he believed Daisy would want, building his fortune through bootlegging and shady business deals. But in the end, all his wealth and ambition couldn't buy him what he really wanted. After Gatsby's death, I found myself disillusioned with the East and the people who lived there. The Buchanans, Jordan, all of them. They were hollow, careless, playing at life without ever really living it. They destroyed things and people, then retreated back into their money, leaving others to clean up the mess. I moved back to the Midwest, where things were simpler, more real. But I couldn't forget Gatsby. He had believed in the green light at the end of Daisy's dock, that symbol of everything he had worked for, everything he had hoped for. But it was just an illusion, a dream that had already passed him by. Like the American dream itself, Gatsby's vision of the future was just out of reach, and in chasing it, he had lost everything. In the end, Gatsby was a man who had come from nothing and built himself into something extraordinary, but it wasn't enough. His dream was too big, too impossible, and it had destroyed him. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. If you enjoyed this condensed book, hit the subscribe button to be a part of Quick Reads for People with No Patience, and see the description below to find out how you can get the original classic and related items you might enjoy. Who knows, we might have piqued your interest.